We'll begin with a tremendous, hopefully, panel discussion led by Vicky Sato on the business of regenerative medicine. I don't think we need to, there is really a need to introduce Vicky Sato in our ecosystem. I will only say that Vicky has been the president of Vertex Pharmaceuticals. She's a board member of BMS, a board member of Perkin-Elmer, chairman of the board of Denali. But more importantly, Vicky's heart is crimson. And Vicky received her bachelor's degree from the Radcliffe College, PhD from Harvard University. Vicky has been the founder of the Blavatnik Fellowship in Life Science Entrepreneurship here at HBS. She's a member of the Blavatnik Accelerator Advisory Board, and she has been my true friend and partner. And thank you again, Vicky, for all you've done for us. This could not have happened without you.
Thank you, Andy.
So, Vicky, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And
You're terrific. So I'm going to invite my panelists up to sit down here. You can read their bios in the book. We, unlike the science panels, because we are the business panel, we are not going to give short PowerPoint presentations about our cool stuff. We're going to get right into the nitty-gritty of discussing David Green's point, which is are there businesses to be created here, and how do we do it better this time around? However, before we start, there's a very important thing we have to do here, which is at the break, I was talking to Mark Fishman, who's trying to remember the name of a movie in which, let's see if I've got that right, a call girl is collecting all the hotel soaps and so forth, something like that. So, right, soaps from the hotel rooms and things like that. So, and it's not Pretty Women. So is anybody in the audience actually know the name of this movie? Because if we can't tell him, he's not going to pay attention to my panel. I'll slip him a note.
Sorry, I obviously.
Alrighty. Well, I have a fantastic panel here, and this panel was, as you can tell from their bios, really selected to help us address a couple of different things about how do we move the kind of high-impact transformative science that we heard about in the last hour into businesses that can actually deliver this kind of innovation for high value. How do we help this kind of science? How do we help the scientists create more value, capture that value, and ultimately, to David's point, hopefully we distribute that value to investors and shareholders. It's a complicated business, the science. There's no question, as Mark says, this science works. And as Larry pointed out, I think as business people, we have the obligation, the responsibility to try to bring this science in an efficient way to the marketplace. So we're going to have a discussion around some of these things and to talk about some of the issues. And we have represented on this panel entrepreneurs, theorists about reimbursement and pricing and operations, practitioners of scale-up, and investors in innovation. So I think you should feel free to ask this group just about anything you want, but I'll start by asking them a couple questions, and you can interrupt anytime you want. So I'm going to start with this investment issue, because this is a hot place. There's a lot of money going into this stuff right now, right? So we heard about some very good science. Many of these scientists are either raising or have raised significant funds for innovation. And one can ask, is this too early or too late? What is stimulating the interest in investment? Sounds like the cover of Nature to me, not so obvious that it sounds like products rolling out the door. So Alexia, you've been an aggressive investor in this area. You're investing in at least one of our previous panelists. So why is now the time to do this?
Thanks, Vicki, and thanks for the invitation to be here and part of this great panel. I thought the discussion from that fantastic science panel queued up very nicely to this session and was going with the questions from the audience at the end of saying, is it too early, is it not too early? So I agree very, very much with the thesis that was put forward in the previous panel. This is going to be one of the great waves of biomedical innovation. And fundamentally, we want to cure disease and extend high quality lifespan. And this is going to be one of the ways to go do that. But I think, as the panelists emphasized as well before, this is the early innings. So, and there's an enormous amount of noise that is out there. So when you take something that has clearly the potential to be so transformative that in a robust capital formation environment, and we have to acknowledge in the last couple of years, we have been in a very robust early capital formation environment for life sciences, that's going to attract a lot of money flowing. I think as we were getting in that discussion with the science panel, not all of that is going to play out well, because there is a lot of noise and there's a lot of phenomenology. And phenomenology is really difficult, because if you don't really know why what you might be observing in the lab is really working, then you are prone to all sorts of failures that come from that. So what gets me very excited, I think, again, as nicely said by some of the panelists, there are some areas where these approaches clearly work. And that those areas have the opportunity to have further refinement to them, to productize what's possible there. And I think those are areas that you're going to see a lot of early successes that can be very transformational. I would advise caution if what we're looking at are things where we don't really understand the molecular mechanism. And I think this applies across the board, whether we're talking about cells, whether we're talking about small molecules or cocktails of small molecules. If we understand, or at least believe, that we understand what is going on and what we need to do to intervene, then you have a rational basis. Those are the places that are going to be the higher probabilities of success. So really paying attention to where are the places where we really understand the molecular mechanisms that are going on versus things that are more phenomenology, or as I think David Skadden put it, focusing on the places where we know something really works.
So the barometer for things that really work seems to be seems to be getting more challenging as opposed to less. I was commenting that we seem to be in this post-truth age, and so determining, the line between truth and not truth, we seem to be developing a higher and higher tolerance for. So I'm all for truth-seeking behaviors, but I'm not sure that helps me a lot if I were out there trying to do that, Alexi. So I'm glad you've got a good barometer. Stacy and Ann, you're both you are also in the business of investing in these two technologies. Stacy, you're heavily with Fidelity in the area of investing in neuroscience. So regenerative medicine, neuroscience, two tough problems with lots of risk and a long development time frame. So how do you assess risk here? How do you assess risk and opportunity? What do you look for?
Yeah, we're all about risk. I think that neuroscience as a whole has really broken open in terms of investability. And I think we've seen that by true innovation going on. It's come from the identification of biomarkers, the genetics that have told us new biology to go after. It's come from new technologies and new tools. I'm not yet convinced that stem cell biology or regenerative medicine has reached the stage of being a de-risked enough, sure it's going to work enough for neuroscience to put those together. I think there are a few exceptions there, but I think in general, neuroscience is a tough place for regenerative medicine to really see the benefits now. I think it will come, but I don't think we're there yet from an investment. I think in neuroscience, part of the complication is, this is a very complex system. And so the idea of creating cells that can then integrate and make the right connections and go to the right places, these are huge, huge barriers to try to get to. people have been working on Parkinson's disease for a long time. I think that's probably about the closest that we are. And there is a lot of innovation going on there. I think we have seen a lot of promise with being able to, used to be embryonic stem cells. Now I think there's a lot with iPS cells that you could turn into dopaminergic neurons, try to give them back. And I think that that's coming. I think, the idea of potentially MS with oligodendrocytes, maybe something in the retina, there are some places, but I still think I would be putting my investments in neuroscience in other areas right now from a company point of view, from an investment point of view, because I just don't think we're quite there yet. The other challenge that I think that comes up in regenerative medicine is patentability. And I think this is something that I really am curious what other panelists think about, and I would like to discuss a little bit further, because so many of these are, it's almost trade secret or know-how that becomes important as opposed to necessarily IP. I think Parkinson's is a great example. What's really patentable there, as opposed to just advancements that are being made that can go into something. So I think that's an interesting question. The other area that I think is not, I don't know if you would even classify this as regenerative medicine, but I do think there might be potential in neuroscience for ex vivo therapies. Really somehow, whether it's taking microglia and using gene editing, doing some of the really cool technology that's coming along and putting them back in a way almost like CAR T, but to create some sort of protective mechanism, something like that. I think that's another area. But again, to me, these are still very futuristic ideas as opposed to today for what we can do.
So you're a more cautious investor in this area, especially for neuroscience.
Yes, I am.
And I would say that as scientists in the audience have, some comments on this, you should feel free to intervene. And I'm just going to push, please expand on this as well. So, one of the interesting aspects here is scalability. And as you pointed out to me, these businesses all struggled with trying to supply more than 1,000 patients a year, really. So so how do you think about investing, and what do you see as the right opportunities, and where are you very, very cautious?
So I think I have the benefit of being a part of organizations that have spanned the spectrum of, at least from a cell therapy standpoint, with 1995 being when Carticel was first put on the market, at least here in the US and MACI and EU. So, with the Carticel product, I think what had been learned over the past 20 years with that product, and as noted, the recent sale of a company that was sold for $6.5 million on a $40 million revenue that was publicly announced. I think part of what the Genzyme organization learned was how difficult autologous cell therapy is. So I would say this gave me the opportunity to go discuss with my colleagues, like, tell me about this business and what did we learn? And this was a business that many people bang their heads against the wall on a whole set of issues, including manufacturing and how do you get N of 1 batch processing to have a COGS where you can imagine a profit. So N of 1 batch processing is really challenging. This was a centralized model. So in the CAR T world, we've got 2 different models maybe being explored. I think most of it's back in centralization versus having instruments at the clinical sites where patients are being treated and seen. So if you think about those as the 2 extremes, we had the experience with Carticel of autologous cell therapy in a centralized model, very challenging to get that to work. So, and tried for many years with various technologies coming into that process. My second experience was with a company called Pervasis Therapeutics, which some people may know of. Flagship. When I was part of the Flagship team, I was an observer on Pervasis, where Fred Chareau, who was actually from the Genzyme organization, was the CEO of Pervasis. That was not autologous therapy. That was actually an allogeneic product where there was master cell bank, and then made it through phase 2A. And I think that business was acquired by Shire. But that was also another learning, I think, just on my path of even if you solve that challenge of you're out of the autologous world and the N of 1, and you're at least at the point where you have, more batch processing, you still have a very challenging time because you have to demonstrate what the product is doing. You have release profiles that allow you to take that product forward from the CMC, which was brought up earlier, but it's still very challenging to really demonstrate scientifically what the merits of that therapy are when you don't exactly know fully what it is doing. But you can generate some release criteria for FDA and for regulators, but in the end, you do need a commercial outlet. So now we sort of zoom ahead to the CAR T world, and I think what makes that very interesting is that it's a promise of, and is, curative therapy. So I think that concept of curative therapy in oncology, rightly so, has grabbed our attention. I think overall with what we've seen out of Gilead and the infectious disease world, plus CAR T, the bar of pharmaceuticals, one can start to imagine that the bar in certain areas starts to be curative therapy. We've seen that in rare diseases, for example, with Gaucher and the product that Genzyme has on the market, that may be the bar you're trying to meet. So I think that adds an interesting dimension into the reimbursement. And then how might you think about your COGS if reimbursement looks different because it's a curative therapy? Maybe you can get away with the N of 1, but I think in the CAR T space with the gene editing deals that we've seen, as well as the interest around Selectus with Pfizer, that we still have some challenges to solve. That, and of course, in your inventory management, you've got patient information in your inventory at a later time. So you've got kind of those three vignettes, and scalability is still an issue.
So your bar is curative? Your bar for investment is curative?
So I think cell therapy poses a unique set of challenges if the therapy itself is in that embodiment. I think the approach that Kevin and I think Jennifer spoke to the most about, but certainly was discussed on the science panel, was how do you think about what we're learning from developmental biology plus regenerative medicine as we go forward to tackle these areas that we haven't yet tackled. And so I think with decibel and frequency therapeutics, can you begin to look for small molecules or other biologics that invoke these regenerative properties of the body, where the modality is different?
So a different response is, so curative, a bar of curative, or at least very close to it, and then I'm hearing maybe you're not going to invest in the cells, maybe you're going to invest in inducers of, in situ inducers of cells with modalities that are more drug-like. It's interesting to hear how we're all, products of our experience. So having had those particular experiences, I think I would say you're probably in a position to be a discriminating investor. On the other side, I'm going to ask Maury, because Maury is actually in a business that isn't limited to 1,000 patients a year, I don't think. And he's the founder and CEO of Viacord, which is the business of storing umbilical cord cells, a rich source of stem cells. So what lessons have you learned in creating this business? Because you collect, you store, you supply, and you're now in fact exploring the regenerative potential even beyond hematopoietic transplant. So
Yeah, I'll
what
just
can you tell
start by
us?
correcting. I'm not the founder of Viacord. Cynthia Fisher founded Viacord, but we acquired Viacord in 2000, and I ran with T breeders. We had an ex vivo expansion process for hematopoietic stem cells for bone marrow transplant. So I'm aware of manufacturing for single products for single folks. And I just comment on the previous conversations that there's always an S curve in technology. And if you look at proteins, Genzyme used to harvest placenta to get enough to treat, 1,000 placentae to get enough to treat a single patient. When CHO recombinant manufacturing came into play, they could manufacture their protein therapeutic. The same thing with monoclonal antibodies is about manufacturing. Here, if you have the efficacy signal, you still have to be able to manufacture the product. And if you have an auto product, you have all the expenses of single manufacturing. So I think the field will shift. Some of the data on CAR T cells will, I think, lead to processes which will produce universal donors, whether it's mesenchymal stem cells in some cases, which I agree with previous speakers, are sort of a cell that grows like a weed that's searching for an application, or whether it's CAR T cells that are very specific and very targeted and very selective and very efficacious. there has to be a way to really make it a universal product to make the costs come down and available on a general widespread basis. But what we did was we kind of came from it from the other side. We're sort of the poor stepchildren of the stem cell industry. It was recognized that stem cells, hematopoietic stem cells, were in a baby's cord blood when they were born. This goes back to the early 1960s and then was proven with transplants in the late 1980s, 1988. The first kid who was treated with acquired Fanconi anemia was treated with a sibling's cord blood. So recognizing that the baby is born with a goodie bag at their first birthday, the question for us was, under what circumstances would a parent want to save that, and what service could we put in place to do that? So we were pioneers in the service of educating parents and nationalizing the education about cord blood. And at the time, there weren't many indications, and we have battled against societies thinking that you'll never use the cord blood. But I'll tell you, from our experience, we have over 350,000 units in our bank, and we've used about 320 of those. So we went from what was expected about a 1 in 200 to 300,000 probability of use down to about 1 in 1,000 to 1 in 2,000. And we expect with new indications, there's FDA-registered trials today treating kids in blinded crossover studies using cord blood for brain injuries like cerebral palsy and brain dysfunction like autism spectrum disorder, that on first conference publication or conference discussions or presentations looks very, very promising, which may bring the utilization rate down to around 1 in 100. And the availability of a banked unit to take 100 microliters and produce a very strong clonal population of embryonic stem or of inducible pluripotent stem cells has been shown in the literature. To have that for genomic reference later when diseases come on, to have that for haploidentical parents that have strokes or other conditions. Our philosophy around cord blood as a therapeutic is that it has this innate ability, kind of a homologous ability to go to the bone marrow, but autologous is sort of homologous in this case where you infuse a child without chemotherapy or radiation with their own cord blood, and the cells appear to home to the brain. There's arguments of whether the mechanism of action is paracrine or whether it's the cells themselves, but we have evidence the cells actually do make it to the brain and form neural cells. So I think the starting from the beginning, banking the cord blood and driving clinical studies where the utility increases is bringing basically common consumers closer to regenerative medicine and personalized medicine than they ever have been in the past, and probably they will be in the future.
It does raise this issue of bringing regenerative medicine closer to the consumer. And, the pharmaceutical industry has been, I think, justifiably castigated for doing a really bad job of communicating the value equation around what pharmaceutical therapies bring to patients and to the healthcare system generally. And that's going to be no different here, especially as you both have mentioned, the cost of goods is going to be considerable for a while. So Amitabh, what could we be doing, what could this new generation of companies around regenerative medicine be doing, both to you and Rob, prospectively to do a better job of articulating the value proposition for all the stakeholders?
So let me address that by asking Maury a question, which would have to do with the insurance component of the cord blood collection. When Cynthia first founded the company, and I was here at HBS pregnant with my second child when I heard her talk, and for me it was a no-brainer. Even though I'm at an age now where my colleagues are not having children, students that I may have taught in the past are having children, and so I continually try to spread the word. They get it. And I think actually the industry is doing a fine job with the get it component, but it's not paid for. $2,000, $2,500 when you're having your first child or whatever, it's a big deal. So maybe you could say something about what the insurance companies are or are not thinking about with regard to things like that.
They're not interested in supporting it. So we've done a lot with GE Capital and other initially, and then in our own ways to help finance. So it can be as little as $50 a month for a family to bank their cord blood and pay off that, and then the annual fee. I think when we connect it to cerebral palsy, if it is indeed the peer-reviewed journals and it's reproduced in other sites and so forth, that they're in children in need, either with suspected brain injury or hypoxic ischemic encephalopathy or premature birth, which has a high incidence of brain injury, then there will be cases in which there will be cost recovery or insurance that will pay for it. Today, I like to, we're not actually not allowed to use the word biological insurance in the cord blood industry. I like to think of it as a bank. You put it in the bank and it's there. It should be at least as valuable when you put it in, when you take it out, and you hope it's much more valuable, and of course you hope you never need it. But I don't expect, insurance companies turn over their customers, 3 to 5 year life cycle, and as far as transplants, that there's a 1 in 1,666 odds by age 20 that you're going to use it. They're just, it's not odds that they're willing to step up for. But I do think there are going to be specific indications for which it will be insured, reimbursed.
So just to build on that, I think this issue of the insurers not paying for valuable therapies is likely to be an even bigger issue as we start to see breakthroughs in the area of neurodegeneration. I mean, if one of the biopharma companies within 3 miles or 2 miles of here were to discover something and be successful at launching a drug that worked in, say prodromal Alzheimer's, and I had to take this drug at the age of 45, there's no insurance company, no sensible insurance company that should really cover that drug, because this is a problem that will only kind of show up after 65 or 75, and that's Medicare's problem. And I think in the absence of some very genuine insurance reform, either long-term contracts, allowing for long-term contracts, allowing insurers or providers to be responsible for a patient over the life cycle, or allowing for something that economists call securitization, where you essentially are able to, an insurer can make an investment in a person at 45, but some downstream insurer like a Medicare Advantage plan can pay that insurer for that investment. I don't think we're going to see tremendous appetite from insurance companies, and that's a bad thing, because the sort of knowing that there isn't a payer might reduce our appetite to actually make these investments. So I think there's a big opportunity there.
But I do think there are lots of examples of things that are paid for as preventative medicines. I mean, statins, you look at heart, blood pressure medicines. I mean, these are all things that you just have a risk factor that you might develop it many, many, many years down. And those are paid for all the time and taken very widely. So I think part of the issue is on the cost. Yeah. So, if you can keep the cost down, then I think the cost benefit is there and is seen. So, the example, if somebody comes up with a neurodegenerative medicine that's you have to take it as a preventative at 45, people will pay for it. Now, will they pay for it if it's an antibody therapy that's wildly expensive and only has marginal benefit at best? Okay, maybe not. So I think it depends, and that's where regenerative medicine maybe is more challenged because of all the issues we discussed, the expense of and the individualization that has to go into it makes it much harder from a cost-benefit point of view.
It can't be marginal benefit. So if you're talking about anything that requires an N of 1 manufacturing, right? And we could separately talk about innovations that will be coming on cell engineering of whether we truly can have universal cells. But if we're talking about an N of 1 autologous product, which has today a very high cost of goods, although we should all just take the caveat of if the demand is there, in other words, if we have lots of highly efficacious products, let's not assume that we can't engineer that cost down enormously.
It's sort of interesting if you think about what value-based pricing is. Rob and I teach a class at the business school, and over here we always say, well, value is total patient outcomes divided by total spending on patients. We're very good at measuring the denominator. We're very, very good at measuring the denominator. The insurers in particular are especially good at measuring the denominator. The pharmaceutical companies like to talk about the numerator, never talk about the denominator. In fact, they often come up with these stories about if you just pay for our drug, you could actually reduce the denominator, which is something that we rarely see. But it is true that value-based contracting is taken off in a way that I never expected. You see it in two ways. You see, first of all, companies like Harvard Pilgrim right here negotiate incredibly deep discounts with Amgen over Repatha, the PCSK9 drug, over just the real-world performance of that drug, which is exciting. And I think one of the things that Amgen is likely to learn, though, is that these real-world contracts are actually they give you very different results than the trials that you ran for the FDA, right? Because in the real world, there's so many other confounders running around, and that's being held against the manufacturer. I think the other thing that the insurers are moving towards is this idea of indication-based pricing in oncology, which is another version of outcomes-based contracting. There, the idea is that we're going to pay the manufacturer different amounts based on which indication the drug is being used in. I think this also is a very good thing for patients, because patients who benefit in these less marginal conditions would actually have to pay less. But it does mean, unambiguously, that the patients who benefit most from the drugs will have to pay higher prices, or the insurers who are covering them would have to pay the highest prices. So I think there's a world in which this move towards indication-based pricing might allow insurance companies to actually pay less money for drugs where the evidence is small, marginal, or just weak and uncertain.
There's a very hard piece of these costs, too, which is the SG&A. I guess I would put it as the SG&A on this piece. And it comes back to Vicki's point during the prior session, where she talked about what other things are needed to get these successfully to market. And one of the biggest costs, at least from what I was hearing in the earlier panel and from what I've seen in other technologies, is this issue of how do you get this distributed effectively? How do you get a provider to actually begin to agree that this is, one, a trial worth doing, two, it's actually one they're going to engage with, one, they're going to execute to the level that you need them to, the level of expertise. This is no longer, give a pill or, or hook up an IV. This in and of itself is a unique procedure potentially. So I think of the orthopedics example that was discussed earlier, and I think about what is the discussion like when you go to an orthopedic surgeon and you say, by the way, you've got one way that you do things and you treat patients. I've got this other one, and it involves a lot of things outside of you. Would you be interested? And I think it's the equivalent to someone, I teach business school classes based on cases. And I read the case, and then I write a teaching plan, and I try to get all the points out. It'd be the equivalent of someone saying, we'll take that case and we'll feed it into a machine, and out of it will come a teaching plan. And we can even try and deliver it, potentially for you. And we really need you there to kind of be there, though, and present, because you're the professor. And I just wonder if we're going to be in a situation where one of the costs of getting this through, getting it not only through trials, but getting it further into use, is going to be what the supply chain needs. And this may be my perspective as an operations management professor, and I do it was referred to earlier as the boring stuff, and it is absolutely true. It is the boring stuff. And I don't mean to bring up Mark's comment again. He's already gotten enough abuse in this. But it's one of those pieces that I don't think you can push to the side when you think about what are the actual costs of getting this through and commercialized.
There is a technological component to this as well, right? So there are technological solutions to this problem. And I am kind of curious about, A, who's working on the boring stuff, or do we have to wait for companies to form for the boring stuff to get worked on? And is that part of the value equation and the investment thesis for a company? Because I'm old enough to remember when the first generation of biotech companies was started, and everybody was very excited about the first, nanomole of insulin that got produced by bacteria, that the vast majority of scientists in the company were worried about expression levels. And so the gene jocks that got hired were the ones that were really working on enhancing expression, whether it was just by pushing stuff through cells or shutting off SOS pathways or whatever. And it wasn't until those technological breakthroughs happened did the real cost of goods change. But it was a real focus of company R&D and to some modest extent academic R&D. So I'm kind of curious for those of you that are at the cutting edge of making these new enabling regenerative medicines, who's worrying about the science that's going to bring the cost down? Or do we have to have companies do that inside their R&D groups?
Well, companies are certainly thinking about it.
Doing
Doing it, actively working on it, desperately working on it. Certainly at least some that I know of. Some internally will call it their Apollo projects on various different parts where they're trying to increase efficiencies. You also have large companies like GE, which is betting that there's going to be a whole huge business to be built here on this specific topic. You also have, masters of engineering efficiency, such as some companies in China that have this very much on their minds as well and are deploying into it currently. What the speed of the development there, whether that's happening in big global pharma companies, in biotech companies, in the GEs of the world, or in Chinese cost reduction type of efforts, we'll have to see how that proceeds. There's two parts of the equation here, though, when we're thinking about cost that we need to keep in mind. So one are things like the amount of cell culture you have to be doing, which is a driving expense. And you can break in and say, where do the costs come from? The second one is a regulatory question, because a huge amount of the costs come from the certification that you have to do for what type of quality control release on any given sample. How often do you have to test it? What are the manners of testing that you need to be doing to be certifying? And those become questions as well as what does the regulatory bar ultimately equilibrate to as far as what's necessary if we're going to have these N-of-1 products?
A lot of these treatments may be for orphan conditions. So if we're thinking about, putting aside the N-of-1 problem even, just Editas on the street is working on stuff for Usher syndrome, and I don't know how many patients with Usher syndrome we have in the US, but I think thankfully the answer is very, very few. What that means is there won't be a lot of competition either. So the costs may be very high, but the person who's actually able to launch the drug is unlikely to face wave on wave of competition. So this would be very different than, say, the hepatitis C space, where Gilead launches a product, and within a year, you've got two other manufacturers with competing products. And we're seeing this in the immuno-oncology space. We never expected the space to be that crowded, and it's crowded in part because it's a big space. But I think for the orphan diseases, it'll be a smaller space. So the company that can actually access capital, get over all these hurdles, is likely to be successful for a while.
I think Amitabh raises a great point, which is thinking about what the downstream competition might naturally look like. And I think back to, this is more of a device side thing, but when drug-eluting stents came in, and when, that was a rarity in that it was a technology that many people worried wasn't going to take off because, and one piece we haven't talked a lot about today is CMS. And what Medicare reimbursement is doing to either aid or slow down. And at the time, CMS was basically paying for a stent, not necessarily a drug-eluting stent. In fact, and so what would happen is you'd look at the cost of these drug-eluting stents and what we expected the price to be when they came out, and you looked at the number you would tend to need on average, and the Medicare reimbursement for stenting didn't cover it initially. Now, eventually they introduced two DRGs specifically for the use of drug-eluting stents. And part of that might have been the confidence that they felt there was enough competition on the back end that was going to keep these prices under control, that they could begin to reimburse for a technology as opposed to, a condition. I think to Amitabh's point, to the extent we don't have that competition here, it makes the payers probably a little more reluctant, too, to jump out and say, I'm going to try a slightly different approach to pricing here, because it may put them on the hook longer than they'd expect. So,
I have a question about the boring parts. So on the boring parts, I divided into a couple different boring sections. And there's kind of a long boring, a lot of boring. So on your question about who's solving the engineering things around manufacturing, there are a number of different government initiatives now working specifically on this issue of manufacturing for cell therapy and solving those. There's a lot of different locations within the United States working on those. GE Health is putting a lot of money into it. There's a lot of other things that are automating where you can do up to 50 patients, individual patients simultaneously in a single system, in a small unit. So I think that the engineering things will get solved. I'm wondering about the boring questions around how we actually do, let's take CAR-T, for example, the transduction step, where we just looked at, sort of 5 different ways that people were doing it, and then said which ones work. And when you look at which ones work, because everybody's doing it in a very different way, it's hard to figure out what the right way to do it and the way to optimize yours. And so that's sort of where the scientific part of who's going to do the boring science, that I have a question. Because it has to be solved before it goes to the company, because we have to see some sort of success before the company wants to take it on. So on the scientific side, who would do that boring part? It's not very fun. I am a scientist, by the way, by training, so I know it's not, it's not very fun.
I mean, I'll make a general prediction, which is always extraordinarily dangerous.
But fun.
So I think, you always ask the area of what future institutions, academic institutions or departments or areas will become hot moving forward in time. I think we are, again, remember this is very much in the early innings, cell engineering broadly. And this includes multiple things, but it's actually us incorporating programming into cells, but that necessitates the question of how you are doing it and what level of sophistication that you are doing. This is an area where there's started to be just some spectacular papers. Again, just acknowledging this is all really, really early days. And I think there's enormous more work to develop there. But our ability of what in the future, and again, I don't know the time frame on this, and again, that's always extraordinarily difficult. Are we talking 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? But the ability of how we will be able to manipulate cells, which are these remarkable entities, both in terms of what they transform into doing, but what type of logical structure commands that we put in into them, I think is going to become a very fertile area. I think as that becomes more and more developed, you're going to see a lot more work in academic centers as well as in industry.
So you see it as an academic endeavor?
Well, I think there's lots of fundamental questions. I think it's going to be both. I mean, I think you're going to have a lot of things that are going to be pushed forward by needs to products that industry is trying to create. But at the same time, I think academics will be shooting ahead of where industry is, because there'll be lots of fundamental questions that are involved. What is it, the limit of what we can do? So I think this is an area we're going to see more and more developing in. But I think it's going to actually be both academic and industrial. I think that's good.
So you brought up a topic earlier on this issue of where is this going to happen, right? So we can talk about, well, is it going to happen in academia? Is it going to happen in industry? Is it going to happen in freestanding companies? I remember also, because I've been around a long time, this company called Invitron that was one of the first companies that was dedicated to scaling up animal cells. And they were trying to make fluidized bed continuous processes, which would take us out of the batch thing, which would change the economics. And it was very important, and they were a company that was really dedicated to improving processes. But in addition to do you do this in academia? Do you do it in industry? Do you do it in one of these emerging hybrid sort of solution-driven institutions, because it's an important area of understanding and domesticating what we can do with cells? What country does this happen in? And you brought up earlier, one of you brought up earlier the idea that some of this is happening in China. There's a commitment and a skill base perhaps for building the kind of operational infrastructure for both testing and institutionalizing, right, in innovation. And that makes me wonder whether how much of the competitive edge and the know-how and the intellectual property that's going to have leverage in these new businesses around regenerative medicine are going to be offshore. And it's the old, as my colleague Willie Shih is fond of saying, this country's lost the ability to make a flat screen panel, right? And you can say, well, who cares? We don't need to make them. But his point is that we've also lost because we've lost that ability, we've lost the ability to innovate around making better ones. So I do wonder, because I think this is a transformative component of this process. We're going to make this cool science into something that treats more than 2 patients or 100 patients. The issues around manufacturing and cost and all of this package of stuff has to be cracked. And if we all label it boring, what are we going to give away?
I think true innovation in biomedical sciences is still far and above happening here in the US. And I think the academic institutions are driving a lot of that, and I think there's a lot of investment going on in that. I think there's a lot of room and a lot of new, unique collaborations that are going on between academia and biotech companies getting started. And to me, that's where a lot of these breakthroughs are going to happen. Will the manufacturing still happen in the US? Quite possibly not. But will the initial innovation happen here? My bet would be yes.
And where would you see it happening? I mean, are the companies that you're investing, well, you're saying you're not investing in regenerative science.
Well,
Yes, better
we're
just
not
right. Yes,
investing
right.
I'm not investing in regenerative science for neuroscience.
Right.
F Prime Capital is certainly investing in regenerative science as a whole.
And when the resource allocation questions come around to the board, are you funding the people who are working on making it scalable? Or are you funding the people who are discovering the next cool thing?
Fundamentally, right, again, because this is in early innings, we need to first demonstrate where these things are going to have the absolute blow-away effects for patients, that they're going to make a real difference. And the bulk of where those companies are being created is here in the Boston-Cambridge area, although that's much more heavily Cambridge than Boston. We all know rents are going up enormously in Kendall Square. There's an enormous amount of real estate surrounding us right here.
Hey, there are labs opening up right here.
And it would be fantastic if there was actually a commercial developer that this wonderful university would like to partner with to create commercial space, true commercial space in the area, not just academic space. Enormous opportunity here, but Boston, Cambridge, more Cambridge than Boston, and of course the greater San Francisco Bay Area. And right now, again, timelines, it's hard to see into the future. These are the number 1 and number 2 centers of biomedical innovation right now. And I think they're going to clearly remain the number 1 and number 2 centers for biomedical innovation as we look out the next 5 years, and very high probability over the next 10 years. So when we're talking about the formation of new groundbreaking companies, they're going to be happening here. Now, inside those companies, there's an enormous focus as we've just been talking about. So you first have to create the product, you have to put the product into patients, and you have to prove that the product works. I can tell you inside those companies, the first thing is you say, okay, the cost of goods are high now, which requires more capital as you're going through those initial clinical development, because it's just costing you a bunch more money, but you're focused on making that fundamental blow-away innovation. You are then assuming you're going to be able to drive down the costs. That's been an assumption, but again, it's one that a series of the companies are working very hard at, and they're making progress. Yet at the same time, we can say here today, if you want to talk about CAR T therapy, if you want to talk about personalized neoantigen-based vaccines, the costs of those are not where you ultimately want those to be in sustainable businesses. At the same time, I think there is a very confident belief that they're going to be driven down. You asked the question of where are the companies doing that? The innovation and driving them down is happening inside those companies at the moment. But again, this is a global supply chain. People are looking and keeping their eyes, paying a lot of attention to say, how do you ultimately do this in the most efficient process?
I think as the area of gene therapy also continues to have success, so some of the supply chain, issues and sort of the shortage of what's required to potentially supply if everything starts being successful. There's a real shortage just in cell manufacturing sort of broadly, and so CMOs are sort of going gangbusters right now, and companies are having to build some internal capabilities because that CMO isn't there. So I think the other aspect is, as some of these other fields that have pieces of the technology are also having success, they'll start solving parts of problems and coming up with new inventions that could have applicability into what's required potentially for some of these products.
You take WuXi, which has been a classic company that has driven down costs for early stage drug discovery as well as manufacturing, has of course built a plant for cell-based therapy that's located in Philadelphia. So what's that?
I don't know, it's a Chinese-American thing. I don't know. Part of our function as proto-business people, if you will, is to say to the scientists who are developing this technologies, as you form companies, here's some things maybe you need to start thinking about. And when do you start, and how do you make investment decisions in the technologies that you choose? How do you think about the commercial and regulatory barriers that you're going to be faced with. And so I want to come back to the conversation Amitabh and Rob started, which is when is it is it ever too early to start thinking about that? And B, how do you go about really justifying a value-based argument? Right? Because as you're talking about the costs that are being saved through the system, so many of those costs are invisible to people in the company, for example. So one inevitably is at risk of underestimating what the real value proposition is here. So how do we help entrepreneurs think about how to prepare for that discussion and justification? Because if the n gets smaller and the price has to go higher, the discussion doesn't get any easier, right? And we just discussed the fact that we've got technology to do before we can address problems where the n is bigger. So if we're going to actually get this technology out there and show that it has an impact for somebody, paying for it yourself is probably not going to be a solution. So Amitabh and Rob, how do entrepreneurs think about gathering the information that's required to actually evaluate what the value proposition is?
I'm going to let Rob go first.
Good job.
I can't believe I'm going to suggest this, but one thing is the entrepreneur probably, first of all, needs to think about what form they need to be in. You said, we got to start our company. Well, why? Maybe you take your idea and you go to someone else's company, and that's obviously an idea that a lot of my students would tell me I'm absolutely crazy to even think about. But when you do decide you've got this idea and you need to show its value, I think we need to think a little bit about these links to the payer. And it may not be because we need to go to the payer and say, what are you going to pay for this? Or what would you be willing to pay for this? But actually because they hold the data that I think we need to potentially start to make the case. Because really what you have to show is not when you do this, what is the impact on that patient who just got this done relative to someone who didn't get it done. But you actually have to then show what does the spend on everything else look like for those two patients too, right? The avoided surgery because of this particular technique. And understanding there's never a 100% chance that you're going to avoid these things, but if you get a sense that there's a 30% chance, Amitabh and I talk about examples like this all the time in class. I think we probably do it more in the context of just pharmaceuticals that might promise a cure. Sovaldi being the one that I think everyone likes to talk about. Is $82,000 too much or too little for a drug that has some chance of avoiding a transplant down the road for that patient? If it in fact does get a cure for that patient of their hep C. So I think trying to assemble that data of everything else that gets spent on this patient is a key. And the challenge is trying to get that just out of the hospital where this study was happening is not going to cut it. And getting it I think going to the payer is going to be necessary too. And you're going to need a payer who can get a comprehensive picture of what that patient's having done.
So I think I agree with that trajectory. I think for the entrepreneur, my view is a lot like Alexis's, which is the entrepreneur should stick to developing the single best therapy for their patient. And if it's incredible and if it's awesome, then there will be wave on wave of innovation that will reduce the cost of delivering that therapy to the market. So that's my strong view. So, if someone somewhere develops some kind of autologous stem cell therapy for heart attack treatments that every hospital everywhere has to invest in, and they have to buy an incredibly expensive machine to produce that, sort of like a microwave machine that you can't this is not an allogenic therapy. This is not a therapy where I get new heart centrally because it's a heart attack. I need them within 20 minutes. I have to grow them right in the emergency room. My guess is some manufacturer somewhere will figure out that manufacturing process is actually patentable, and that hospital could license the use of that manufacturing process. But all of that will happen only if this is an amazing therapy. If it's not an amazing therapy, it doesn't matter what we do to this manufacturing process. It's probably not worth the entrepreneur thinking about. I think entrepreneurs should probably just stick, doing right by their patients.
So the big problem there for the entrepreneur is how the hell do you get there? So where is that funding going to happen? So the typical issue for someone who's developing a possible therapeutic is you've got an idea, you've got some evidence, and now you're going to have to go from preclinical to clinical. I was fortunate enough to actually get someone on board at that preclinical stage. And what I'm hearing from you and the experience of colleagues, you guys are not going to invest until you are sure I've proven I've got a blockbuster.
It depends on the science. Is the science at a stage that we fundamentally understand, right, using the collective we, what is going on? This patient has this disease. This is the molecular mechanism of what's going on. Here in the case of regenerative medicine, this is specifically the cells we want to use and why. Or if we're using a therapeutic to cause the cells to reprogram or alter their fate in the body, why this is the actual programming system in those cells that we are going to affect and why it's going to work. If that knowledge is there where we actually have a mature understanding, again, whichever modality that we're going into, that I think has been shown now to be very attractive for capital formation. If we don't understand, right, then, and we're basically going after a large leap that is more based on phenomenology, right, we're saying we can do something with these cells in a dish. Of course, as we all know, that's really problematic, because what are these cells? How does it actually match to a real patient's disease? On plastic in a dish, how does that match to what's actually happening in the complex environment of the body? Where it's a whole leap, then you need to have further evidence down the road. I think these are sort of rational places. I think we've seen, and Vicki, you led this off, one, capital formation in early life sciences right now is as high as it's ever been. And in regenerative medicine, it's quite robust as well. So I think we have the capital coming there. It's a question of how compelling is the fundamental science for a given application.
Well, let me be a little bit annoying and say, well, look, you have a sight-saving therapy, right? That's what we heard about earlier. It works. It works in a small number of people, but it works. It would be great if that could be tested broadly and ultimately adopted. So I don't know whether you're drowning in funds to enable this to happen, but I would challenge my colleagues and say, if you're not drowning in funds, what prevents you from investing in developing that technology? Because he does have a pathway. He's got a pathway, if I understood the science, a cellular rationale, and an outcome. So if you're worrying about the money, why should you be worrying about the money?
I'm not. I've got a big sister. So,
Okay.
I'm fine. We're having to develop now, actually, even with having a big sister, is these very questions, which is that big sister is finding it difficult to understand the pathway to actually both reimbursement, to manufacturing, to quality control. So, there are still issues even when you have a big system.
I want to hear from some other people in the audience. So, yes,
so
please.
To add to that, so now do we have to think more about the patient population? Stacy mentioned AD, of course, your background. Is it worth reducing? I mean, 3 more years before they need to be out of the community setting. A spinal cord injury patient, $1 million+ a year for care. If we reduce it to $500,000, I mean, do we have to be more selective about the patient or the disorder? Fibrotic hearts after a heart attack, do we have to really stratify the clinical trial so carefully that that's how you build the value?
Depends. I mean, if you could salami slice the indication to the point that you get an orphan designation, you'd get 7 years of exclusivity. So there are, I mean, that's actually, you were asking a question that I think a lot of companies wrestle with every day, especially in an era of precision medicine. How small of an indication do you seek? There are some benefits to seeking incredibly small indications because you may get an orphan designation. So that's a non-trivial.
Absolutely, and especially gives you entree to a large. I mean, if you develop something for a 10,000 patient population, but it gives you something useful in stroke, because if you say stroke in public, people run away screaming.
Yeah.
So exactly that kind of thing. Or if you reduce the cost of care for an AD patient, slow the time before they're institutionalized by 4 years, that's huge.
Yeah.
But is it a value?
Well, one
that's
thing
right.
is certainly true, that the opportunity to sell those products has increased since we started to change the way doctors and hospitals were paid. Because now there's actually someone willing to pay for treatments that save money in the long term, or may not even save money in the long term, may just be good for the patient. It just reduces human suffering. So I think as we sort of wean ourselves off of some of the fee-for-service Medicare, fee-for-service payments, you do get provider groups capturing some of that value, and they will demonstrate, hopefully, a greater willingness to pay for your valuable innovation and split that value with you. That's the hope.
I think it goes back to what's been said multiple times already on this panel. It's how transformative is the treatment. And that's always front and center, is how transformative is the treatment. And there really is no patient population too small for a truly transformative treatment. And I think that's worth thinking about.
Interesting.
I was wondering about the market of cells alone, or cells in devices initially for research, and whether there's a relationship between developing cells and cells in devices, organ on a chip, can that be a stepping stone to getting things into people?
The magic pyramid of cell therapy is something like the right cell, the right place, at the right time. And if you're doing something, a small organ that needs very few cells, manufacturing is significantly reduced. If you need billions of cells per patient, then manufacturing MSCs, for instance, on very large surface areas, and the dynamics of cultures, whether they're fluidized beds or suspended cultures, and all that leads to the efficacy of the drug or the cells. But one thing that happens in the process of, as many realize, of going through the FDA and through clinical studies, is that you have to lock down your CMC and your drug master file very early. So I think there's going to, sort of survival of the fittest, that the best therapies will make it to a certain point, and then if they have to be re-engineered, they'll have to re-engineered under either another application or some crossover study. But to get to the questions about the socioeconomic value requires phase 4 studies and so forth. So it's a long, arduous process. So the value proposition of the treatment has to be there to sustain through that very boring valley of death that every company has to go through in this space.
I have time for one more question. Yes, please.
I'd be interested in the panel's view of the following. Namely, we held a session here at the business school earlier this year, and one of the speakers was Andrew Lowe from MIT, who talked about the paper he'd written earlier in the year on the notion of healthcare loans, where individuals can take out healthcare loans for curative therapies. So that was one of the ingoing assumptions. And pay for value as they receive it over time. And that those loans in turn can be securitized packages, so not unlike what has been done in college loans, home loans, et cetera. What do you think of that as an accelerant for the field? We talked about what the insurance companies might do, but the notion of that hasn't been raised yet.
In the case of Sovaldi, what happened was that the healthcare system, Medicaid in particular, its spending went up through the roof, and Medicaid, being a state program, cannot borrow from the future. And so it incurred this incredible one-time cost all at once. There was no ability for it to absorb that cost all at once, and so then the states played this game of demonizing the manufacturer instead of saying we should be dancing in the streets for what Gilead just did. If there was a drug mortgage, the 50 states could have dropped a bomb on hepatitis C and paid for it over 5 or 6 years. And I think that right now there's a lot of opposition to drug mortgages from the insurance companies, mostly because they know that if they go down the path of creating and building drug mortgages, that will actually expand demand for treatments, right? The treatments will be available to more people. That means higher prices, right? Which is exactly the wrong way to think about it. The right way to think about it is, does this extra spending generate more value than the spending it generates? And I think in the case of Gilead's treatment, it's a wonderful thing. And so we should have done it there.
Back to Amitabh's point, which is, why insurers are going to be the one place where people will go, well, they'll say the risk can actually be somewhat pooled. But then the insurers will also look at this other effect of it and maybe not be quite as excited in pursuing it.
I think one concern from the insurers, which is correct, though, is the place to have done it was Sovaldi. Curative, the real-world evidence matches the clinical trial data.
That was good.
It's incredible. You're not going to get a drug as good as that. I think the worry is that you might have another wave of breakthroughs for, say, novel CF drugs, where what you really care about is weight gain. What the clinical trials are measuring is forced lung expiration. That's sort of incredibly important, but not quite weight gain. Now the insurers will say, that was a surrogate endpoint. I don't want to take out a mortgage for that surrogate endpoint. So I think there's some research for these loans to take off. We have to do better science on mapping surrogate endpoints, not only in oncology, but in all of healthcare, to the actual outcomes, to get insurers to buy into that. That becomes another example of work that we have.
So I'm getting the signal to close down here because we have an exciting close. My take-home lesson from the panelists to the entrepreneurs and scientists in the audience is, quite seriously, make sure it's transformative. Don't kid yourself if it's a 10% improvement. Make sure it's transformative. Make sure you start thinking early about gathering the data that supports your value proposition for that transformative thing. And the boring bits are going to take a lot of dollars and need to be done. So I think that they're quite serious hurdles for implementation. And I thank you all very much. Thank you.